who here is already doing, has done, whatever that means, Kanban? Anybody? Some hands? Mixture? How many feel like you're sort of...
Carl, you don't count. Cheating. How many of you feel like you really know it, you really are comfortable with that, Kanban is something beyond the one scene you saw in Silicon Valley, if you saw that episode? Yeah. Not many hands. We're feeling relatively novice. All right. Well, that's good. Keep that thinking. My name's John Terry, and I want to talk to you about how to get started with Kanban. Not just sort of what is Kanban, but how to do it. A little bit about me, semi-credibility. I'm the CEO of a company called LeanKit. We make Kanban software. I'm not going to talk to you about my product today at all. Before that, I was director of project management for a very large hospital system, multinational hospital system, where I implemented Lean at large scale for that company. So I've been part of a very small startup doing Kanban, and I've been part of a very large corporate doing Kanban. And I've worked with companies from law firms to marketing firms to sales companies to engineering firms doing this. So I think I can tell you confidently that the stuff I'm going to talk about works, will work for you. I've seen it work in lots of different places. Before I get started specifically about Kanban, I want to talk a little bit about the landscape. So first, even though we in the Agile world are often in a circular firing squad of competing methodologies, this is the real enemy. This is really still what we're trying to fight against. And with all due respect to Gartner and their two-speed IT, that's garbage. This is no way to run an organization. It might have been in the 1960s, I don't know, but it's not now. These sorts of long time period, large batch project methodologies are an attempt to control change. You can make change go away in some way, and that's not the real world. That's not how the world works. I mean, if you have a multi-year project, these days technology standards change 2 or 3 times before you're done, and that's no way to run a railroad. So we really need to understand that we have to adapt to the new world of constant change. We have to take up methodologies that allow us to deal with the bad change, because it's going to come, and also be in a position to embrace the good change and run our organizations so that we can do that. Another little bit of myth busting. Within the IT software development world, when people speak of Agile, this is often what they mean. They believe that Agile is mostly filled with Scrum. There's this Lean Kanban. Is it Kanban Lean, Lean-Kanban, Lean/Kanban? Are they the same thing? I'm really not sure. There's some old super ninja coders who do XP, and people in England do DSDM. But that's not true. This is really a better way to look at the world and what's going on in the world of modern management methods. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. This is not a history lesson, but I want you to understand that the change that's happening in Agile in the software world is part of a broad-based change that's applying across lots and lots of industries. And in most industries, it falls under the label of Lean. Now, I don't want to get too hung up on that, sort of a methodology war kind of a thing, but the reason why that's potentially useful for you to understand is that as you talk with the things you're trying to talk with other folks about the things you're trying to do in your organization, sometimes talking in Lean terms can be useful because it may be more what they are used to, and especially if you're talking at sort of the large-scale corporate enterprise level, people will often be very familiar with Lean terminology, and so it can be a useful way to communicate. It's also useful because there's learnings. I mean, some of the greatest learnings I've had as a software guy have been going out on construction job sites, or going into Lean hospitals, or going to engineering firms and seeing what they're doing, and it makes sort of new things click in my head about the world that I work in, and I do a better job. So I'm going to spend most of this talk talking about Kanban specifically. And this is something where I will sort of invite disagreement maybe with certain people. In my viewpoint, let me go back to this slide. Kanban is a tool within the lean and agile world. And most of the things we talk about in that world in terms of principles are not part of Kanban. Kanban is a tool that can be used to apply them. So lean principles that we're seeing up here, the point, in my view, the value of Kanban is not just, well, you visualize work. It's that it gives you a mechanism for making these other things happen. And these are really the point. Kanban, in the end, is a measurement system. It's a way of better understanding what's happening, but this is what we're trying to make happen. And Kanban is one of many lean tools that I would invite you to go out and learn a lot more about. So again, my talk is not about most of these tools, but to effectively do lean and to gain the fullest value out of Kanban, you're going to want to understand where the bottlenecks are in your organization, because that affects the flow of work that you're going to do. Establishing cadence for your organization, because even though you might be doing continuous delivery, that should be your aspiration in the software world, nevertheless, there is a value to cadence. Don't let anybody tell you different. People like cadence. People are used to the annual calendar, the monthly calendar, the calendar of weeks, and so establishing things that fall in that cadence is useful. Empowering people with some form of andon, some ability to stop the line, so they have a control of that they are empowered to stop and fix things now rather than just suffering problems. There's the comic you might have seen of the people pulling the cart with square wheels, and somebody's holding up the round wheel, and they say they're too busy to improve. Well, andon, and I would submit to you, Kanban, are tools that give you the time to make those improvements. A3, batch size reduction, Kaizen, and the idea of Gemba. All of these tools are things that you really need to be exploring and learning about as you go on your lean journey and as you apply Kanban. This is all of these things, these tools, these principles, while you don't necessarily need to start in any order, they are much more powerful and they are much more sustainable if you implement more and more of them. You get an interlocking system of support that makes the whole thing work better. And that's really important. That's really important. Change is hard. The bigger your organization is, the harder the change is to really make work and make stick. And I can tell you, as somebody who's made changes at the scale of nearly 1,000 people, and then seeing those changes wither away because they didn't reach all 5,000 people, and that's really what was required. Having systems in place that help the changes hold on and root in when people get tired and there's management changes and those kinds of things, crucially important. You got to understand that the initial sort of wave of enthusiasm is going to pass, and you've got to have the tools in place that help you to hold on. All right, so like I said, I'm going to spend most of my time here talking about Kanban specifically. And yes, it is true that we use sticky notes. 3M makes a great product that'll help you get started using Kanban, but there really is a lot more to it than that. I mean, people who say, well, what, all you got to do is put up some sticky notes on a wall. Sure, to get started, that's true, but that's really not the point. It's when you're thinking about Kanban, it's really much more effective, or it's a better. It'll help you understand things better if what you think about what you're doing is really establishing a value stream map, a dynamic value stream map. So folks who have done lean, value stream mapping is a tool that's used to establish the process steps within your organization for a particular flow, and understanding the time that it takes for both the working parts of the process flow and also for the waiting stages. And what you're really trying to understand is, where are those waiting stages? because that's your best opportunity for improvement as an organization. So value stream mapping is a tool that people in Lean have been using for decades, and it's an extremely powerful tool. However, as usually done, value stream mapping is a static exercise. It's a one-time exercise. You go out and do it. It's sort of a time study analysis, and it gives you, a better understanding of where you can go and look for opportunities for improvement. Kanban really is the same thing. It's those same stages. They're just represented by lanes and stickies rather than by something like this. That's what we're trying to do. This is a dynamic value stream map. So for folks in the Kanban world, there's lots of schools of thought, differences of opinion, but most people will agree on these 6 ideas as sort of core tenets of doing Kanban. And I would say these are core tenets of doing Kanban across pretty much any discipline. I would also say, contra to some folks who would say that Kanban for software or for knowledge work is fundamentally different from Kanban as it relates to inventory management and workflow within manufacturing companies. I would say that that's not true. I would say that these same things describe that. And so again, the opportunity to go out and explore a very broad literature is really there, very powerful. So what are we doing in Kanban? The goal, the starting point is to visualize your workflow. Visualize your current workflow. What you're trying to do with Kanban, thus the title of the talk, is to evolve from where you are now, rather than other methods in Agile which say, throw out what you're doing now and change radically to a new thing. In the world of Lean, that would be to say that Kanban is a Kaizen method. It's a method of small, gradual improvement, which add up eventually to large improvements, rather than Kaikaku, which is a radical breaking change. Both can be powerful, can be important, and depending on what's going on with your organization, breaking change may be the right thing for you. But I would suggest that pretty much any organization can adopt Kanban's way of gradual evolutionary change. So we're going to visualize our current workflow. We're then going to limit work in progress. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time of detail on this, but this is so important. If you're not limiting your work in progress, your work in process, you're not doing Kanban. Can't say that enough. That oftentimes people will implicitly limit work in progress. Going back to my previous slide here, eventually you run out of space in the column for sticky notes, and that's a work in progress limit. But usually the correct work in progress limits are a lot lower than that, and you definitely want to get there as you gain the political capital and the ability to do that. We're trying to manage for smooth flow. That's a big part of the goal here. Lean organizations understand that disruptions in the flow of value going through a system have really long-running effects. There's something that we talk about in the world of Lean that's called the Bullwhip Effect. And so very small oscillations in the amount of work in one part of your system go upstream in bigger and bigger waves. So if you think about a bullwhip cracking, at the tip it's moving millimeters, at the back end it's moving feet up and down. And that's the way things work in organizations. So you're trying to achieve smooth flow throughout the entire organization, because you might not understand that the small oscillations in your part of things have a big impact on other people. We're trying to make process policies explicit, which, what does that mean? Well, first, one way of thinking about this absolutely is just the Kanban board itself. So people often start with just sort of to-do, doing, done, or backlog, ready to start, in progress, testing, in very simple boards. But over time, what we're trying to do is evolve to relatively complex boards which do a better job of describing what's going on in the organization as it evolves, putting clear, visible signals on the wall that help people understand what to do. We're trying to move away from a world where I have to go and look in a manual to know what the rules are. and instead I just look up at the wall. The world around me, the visible world around me, tells me what I need to do a good job. I don't have to go look for what to do right. We're trying to implement feedback loops. This is all about evolutionary change. This is about continuous small evolutionary change, and that's built on feedback loops. That's built on continuous conversation up and down the value stream with all of the people involved so that you can collaborate to improve things. And thus the last thing here, the goal here is, you might say, middle out change. So this is not necessarily sort of skunk works from the bottom, hide it in a secret box kind of a change, nor is it driven from the top change. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to connect people and teams together so that they can collaborate to improve things, again, using Kanban in order to implement Lean. Kanban is not a thing in and of itself. It's a measuring system. It's a mechanism for making things visible. Okay, so why is visualization? Why is that so important? So this spreadsheet here is in ancient Greek. I'm guessing most of you can't read it. I certainly can't. I don't know if there might be some biblical scholars in the room, but probably not. It's a little bit of a joke here, but it's to a point. So text, in order for me to understand what's going on in text, in a status report, in a project communication, I have to understand all of it in order to understand the totality of what's going on. And a lot of what I have to understand when I have to decode is really not valuable. Ideally, when I'm managing, whether I'm a manager managing or the team managing itself, you're wanting to manage by exception. You really only want to spend your calories on managing the things that are bad, that are different, that are unusual, that are worthy of attention. But when I manage by text, I have to decode all of the text to understand in one case somebody wrote defect, in another case somebody wrote bug, in another case somebody wrote issue, in another case somebody wrote problem, etc. on all these lines. Now sort of, I used a few examples that are specifically software development, but if we're doing any kind of a project of any scale, you're going to have many different specialties, some of which aren't even technical specialties. They're not IT people. You've got finance people, you've got marketing people, you've got sales people, all those kind of folks. Each one of them essentially speaks a different language. And so when you're bringing together status information from them, they might as well be speaking Greek to each other. And so you have to do a lot of effort to help those people understand each other when you're operating in text. On the other hand, this is the very same status information presented as a Kanban board. The words are actually still in Greek. But if I understand some pretty simple conventions of a Kanban board, I can see that usually red is a bad thing. So I can see that there's a fair amount of red on this board. If I saw a lot more, that might be a problem. Usually things start at the left-hand side of the board and they move to the right-hand side of the board. And so what I can see here is that I have several lanes that have quite a bit in them, and I have several lanes that have almost nothing in them at all. And so I can look at this board and I can get a tremendous amount of information even without reading it at all. And so at a glance. And so if you think about, again, the ability to manage by walking around for senior managers, an organization that uses Kanban extensively, uses Kanban boards, you can just walk down the hall and look left and look right at the Kanban boards and understand, oh, wow, there's one of these boards that has 20 red cards stacked up in a single lane. This is a problem. I need to go over and talk to those people. There's a board that has almost all the cards at the left. They're not making much progress. There's a board that has almost everything over at the right. Fantastic, we're making great progress. I'm going to go over and congratulate those people and thank them for doing a good job. But I don't have to decode much at all before I get enough information to understand the basics. One of the things that you hear talked about in the world of visual management, the world of Kanban, is the 3-meter, 3-second rule. And that is that an effectively constructed Kanban board from about 10 feet away, from about 3 meters away, in just a few seconds, in a glance, I can get a tremendous amount of information. That's what we're aiming for. great. I hope you're convinced that there's some power to Kanban, but how do you get started? That's often one of the challenges that people have about getting going with Kanban. They'll say, great, I get it, seems simple. And then they say, so I'm supposed to visualize my process. What is my process? What is our process? Can somebody go out and get the manual? What is it we're doing? And so we have some exercises that we do, and I'll show you a screenshot later at the end. This is sort of pulled out from a roadmap that we have with LeanKit called the Kanban Roadmap, which is basically the materials and the time and so on that you need in order to get started doing Kanban for your team. But I'm going to sort of give you the high-level overview of these things. So first exercise, and this is so important. If you are the manager of the team, or if you have the manager of your team who's a reasonable person and will be willing to listen when you say this, sit at the back of the room, sit on your hands, do your level best to say nothing, and let the team talk. Because if you, the manager, starts off saying, oh, this is our process, it's going to be very hard for the members of your team to argue and say, well, it's not. And even if they're relatively brave and if you have a good relationship, they might push back on details, but they might miss sort of fundamental disconnects that are going on. So it's really important to let the team express the process. And the way we have them do this is not by saying, well, we have a 5-step process. Here they are. Let's just start writing the lanes down. What we do is we have people write down some of their current work items, sticky notes. Just write down a few things, a handful of things you're working on right now. And then you go around the table and ask people, all right, pick up one of those things, describe it to the whole group, and in essence say, this is the work. This is what I'm doing to it in order to make it more valuable. I got it from so-and-so, and I think that what they were doing with it was X. And when I'm done with it, as I understand it, I'm going to hand it to Y, and I believe that they're going to do this to it to make it more valuable. And so what you're trying to do is, through the work items, express the process steps of your organization, your team. And in essence, that this is what you're going to come up with, is sort of each card you're going to describe the doing now, the did before, the what's next. And as you overlap those and erase the whiteboard over and over and over again, you're gradually going to come to an understanding of your process flow via the actual work. That's what we're trying to do here. The next thing we're going to do, and again, it's usually, that first thing is an exercise unto itself. I've seen that process take 2 hours with a team of 10 people to go through that, because you will be maybe surprised, maybe not. I'm sort of constantly amazed, and have seen people be amazed by the understanding they gain about, well, I didn't know you did that. Why do you do that? Didn't we stop doing that? Why aren't you doing, et cetera, et cetera. So the learning that happens there, it's not a documentation process. It's a knowledge creation process and a learning process. The next workshop is to come together and actually get the work on the board. So we're going to have people list their work out, their full current workload. Again, not what, managers, hush. What we're asking people to do is put down what they think they are working on, what they're actively working on. Not things later, not sort of their backlog, but what are you truly working on? And then categorize those work items in whatever makes sense to them as a person. Collate those things together, and then turn those things into cards on a board. Again, it never ceases to amaze how often that results in, well, why are you doing that? Didn't we stop doing that? Aren't you supposed to be working on? I thought I was working on that. Why are we both doing this? Tremendously powerful exercise, just sort of the wisdom of crowds in doing this. As you figure out, again, the initial thing is to sort of free form and just say, have people describe for themselves what the work item types are. But when you bring these things together, you really want to aim for as short a list as possible. There's a temptation which sometimes software systems can make even worse, to try to make this exhaustive. We want to categorize this every possible way that we can in order to be able to make better decisions because we have better data. That might make sense over time to evolve that way. But when you start out, really what you're aiming for, again, is visual communication quickly achieved. And fewer colors, which is usually the work item types, makes that work better. So fewer work item types is really is an important thing to do. What we're looking for in this is a focus on results. So not usually, and there's a place for this sometimes, but usually you don't want your Kanban board to be a task board. There can be a value to having a task board at some level, but fundamentally you want your main Kanban board to be visualizing the flow of the work, the flow of the value as it goes through process steps. Now, usually what ends up happening is your columns are going to end up representing verbs, and your cards end up representing nouns. So the verbs act on the nouns in a progressive fashion in order to make the nouns, the cards, more and more valuable as you go. And again, sort of thinking about this as a color system, 4 colors, 5 colors, 6 colors is pretty easy to manage. If I go past that, what I'm dealing with is multiple shades of blue, multiple shades of green, and having a really hard time understanding what the difference between those is at a glance. So what we're trying to do there is we're trying to visualize the work as it is. Visualize our current work, not improve it. Resist the temptation. There's an extreme temptation. I just described to you how people will often come up with, they'll discover all kinds of problems in their process as they have these conversations. But resist the temptation to start changing things. Because you don't know, you may have a hunch that things are bad. I don't know, some of them may be just so egregiously bad, go ahead. But really what you want to do is you want to start working with the board in order to measure things, in order to understand where the real opportunities for improvement are. Because improvement is work. Improvement takes time, and you need to focus your improvement efforts. You have to have whip limits for your improvement efforts, just like you have whip limits for the actual work flowing through the system. And you want to know that you're focusing those things on the right things. So resist the temptation to just start changing things, even though it might seem like there's obvious opportunities for those. So build the board, populate the board, get going, start using this. Feedback loops. One of the obvious feedback loops for all Agile teams, whether Lean, Agile, Kanban, Scrum, whatever it might be, are daily stand-ups. Scrum talks about having daily stand-ups. Do these daily all the time. It is usually right to start with daily stand-ups for a Kanban team at the beginning. My experience is over time you end up needing to have fewer. You don't have to have them on a daily basis because a lot of the information that's getting conveyed in those meetings is actually getting conveyed by the board, and if the board is visible to everybody, you need to spend less time manually communicating it, if you will. But to begin with, daily stand-ups are a powerful thing. As short as you can make them. Unlike the sort of Scrum style stand-up where it's what did you do today, what are you going to do what did you do yesterday, what are you going to do today, what's in your way. Most of those things should be on the board already, and you don't need to talk about them. We're really trying to focus a Kanban stand-up on the outliers, the exceptions, the problems. So you got to make sure that the board is complete and accurate for that to work. Usually not true at the beginning. It takes a while to make sure that people are doing that. Once you have a complete and accurate board, you want to focus first on the expedites and the blockers. The outliers, the problems, whether they be blockers, problems, negative problems, or expedites, which at least in theory should be positive problems. We've got to get this done because there's huge value in getting this thing done right. So focusing the entire team not on their work, but on what the most important thing for the team is. Once you're done talking about those things, you want to walk the board. If you think about a Kanban board, if you think, whatever kind of a process flow, the value is all at the end. Things that are closer to done are more valuable. Finishing them is more important than starting or working on things that are only just now getting started. So what you want to do is you want to focus the entire team on the right-hand side of the board, talking about the things that are closest to finished, and making sure that we know what's needed to get it done, and if there's any ability for people other than the immediate actor on that item to help get it done, identifying those things and knocking them out. If the closest thing to done is a testing stage, and there's any way that a developer or maybe the product manager or anybody who had input on earlier stages in the process to sit and talk with the tester, rapid feedback loops and getting things done so that there's not long cycles going back and forth, that's much more important than that person individually sitting and doing their work. You're really trying to focus on the work of the team and things that are done. And stopping when time runs out. So setting a fixed clock. We in Lean Kit, we always set the iPhone duck, and we talk about setting like a 5-minute duck or a 10-minute duck. You really want to set a time and end the meeting when it's done, because if you really did spend your meeting focused on the expedites, the blockers, the things that are close to getting done, if you have more things you need to work on that's going to run your time over, like if you have a 10-person team, if you've got more than 10 minutes of talking about expedites, blockers, and problems, you probably don't actually have time to solve those problems today. So stop and solve the problems that you've actually already unearthed before you move on and find more. We're really focused here on the delivery of value by the team, not individuals. And again, that's why we're not doing the round robin of what am I doing? What am I going to do later? What are my problems? Who cares about my problems? What are the team's problems? So that's one form of feedback loop. That's a daily, or over time, maybe it's 3 times a week or 2 times a week kind of a feedback loop. A short one. We also want to hold regular retrospectives. I've heard people say, well, in Kanban you should only do sort of retrospectives on demand when needed. I don't know. Maybe there's some people who are disciplined enough to do that. I think that there's a value to having a cadence of regular retrospectives that are set up. This is a time where we're going to do this, so we don't forget. We make sure to sort of take our medicine. However, it is extremely important that the team understand that when we have a severe problem, a stop the line, a bottleneck, we really should stop right then and swarm around it and understand what's going on, hold a retrospective right there. And when we do it, we're aiming not to talk about just how do we get the line flowing again. We're aiming to figure out why did the line block up in the first place so that we can implement countermeasures so we can avoid having that happen in the future. That's what we're trying to do with our retrospectives, not just solve problems, not just fix issues in the output, but we're trying to fix issues in the system so that the system becomes progressively smoother and more capable of not solving problems in the first place. That's that and-on idea that I talked about in Lean. When we have retrospectives, especially when we have set down retrospectives, regular cadence retrospectives, it's useful to have a sort of a format to those, a standard format. My suggestion is not to use the typical, what did we do well, what could we do better, what do you guys think are the problems kind of a thing. If you do that, the temptation is going to be towards recency bias in the first place, and chewing on something that happened yesterday, whether or not it's a big problem, and also sort of letting bygones be bygones on the other hand. You might have had serious problems, but if they're a while ago, there's a temptation to say, well, that's over. Let's not dredge that up. Let's not deal with it. You're much better off, I think, to let data be your guide. rather than saying, what do we think are our problems? If you're using a Kanban board is a tool for collecting data. Every card that goes on the board, every movement of every card is measurable, whether you do that manually and keep a spreadsheet or whether you're using an electronic tool that does it for you. You're generating tremendous amounts of process data. And that process data is the best tool you have for improving your process. When you're trying to improve a process, you want to be focused on the outliers, not the average. Your leverage for improvement is on the outliers. So, look, if I've got an average, a mean cycle time here, in sort of the 20s to 40 day range as it is on this chart, work items, no matter how annoying that took 20 to 40 days, if I spend my time focusing on problems with them, those are not high leverage problems. Those are not the problems that are going to move the needle in terms of my ability to get faster. The ones that are going to move the needle are going to be the outliers, like those things above the red line there, in the 100-day range, multi-100-day range. So keeping track of those outliers and using those as the things that I focus my retrospectives on is going to give you much more powerful information for improving your process. So what you want to do, if I use something like a process control chart to gather information on my outliers, I can gather those outliers together, and then what I want to do is, there's sort of a wheat from the chaff separating exercise, where I'm trying to identify which things are problems I can affect, and which are problems I can't. So common cause versus special cause variation here. I'm not going to stress about, there was a hurricane, and so we were slowed down for a week. Can you do anything about hurricanes? Probably not. Okay, move on. But if you do an analysis and you find out that, wow, of the 10 outliers on my board, 5 of them related to a particular technology, or they're related to a particular business owner, or they're related to a particular step in my process, or certain people, skill sets, whatever it might be, you have really interesting information to dig into in order to improve things. What we're wanting to do with each one of those is we're wanting to go through a 5 whys exercise. So that, you may or may not need to get to 5, and sometimes maybe you need to dig deeper. But what you're wanting to do is not stop at the initial, like, hey, why did this happen? Well, blah, blah, blah. Because that's going to lead you to sort of solving surface problems, solving the immediate problems, rather than dealing with underlying issues. So why did this happen? Because this. Well, why did that happen? Well, because blah, blah, blah. Why did that happen? Digging deeper and digging deeper and digging deeper until you're at the real reason, the real root cause for that. Some common root causes that we find, you will find these all the time. Hidden whip. People go through this exercise of getting work on the board, getting their whip on the board. They almost always fail at getting all of it. And so what they discover is, well, why was this taking so long? Well, because people were actually working on these other things that were not represented on the board. So hidden whip is a big thing. You will often find that the things that took a long time, there was a lot of interruptions in the flow of work on them. So they stop, start, stop, start, stop, start. And so that, something would get hard about it, and they would go and work on something else. There's an extreme temptation. There's actually, it is true that sometimes people get pulled onto other things by the boss saying, stop working on that thing and come work on this other thing. It's true, we do get interrupted by the boss. But very often we also get interrupted by, I don't know how to do this. This is tough. Maybe I'll put this down and go work on something else because that's easier, and maybe I'll get smarter by tomorrow and this thing will become easier again. Getting to the idea where we want to stop starting, we want to start finishing, that's often a root cause for problems. Downstream or external blockages. You will often find that the blockers in your process are not actually in your team, They're actually in some sort of a handoff that you have with external teams. And so realizing that and understanding that is a powerful tool for process improvement. Uneven sizing in the cards. At first when people start putting cards down on the board, they will be, all you're saying is get it on the board. And you'll end up with things that are, some are bread boxes and some are buses. Some are 1 day, some are 15 days. And probably what those things would have been better off being is different work item types, which you would measure differently. You often find that you actually don't have a process, you have multiple processes. And different work item types actually follow different processes. And if you better visualize those different processes, you would gain a better understanding of how work is flowing through each one of those sub-processes. And you would have better information for improving that. And rework. Cards that loop in the process, cards that get stuck and have to be worked on multiple times, that's often a reason for things taking especially a long time. People will, there's schools of thought about rework and what to do on a Kanban board. Some people will say it should stop where it is and it should be fixed in place. You should sort of swarm to the work and fix it there. I can sort of see I don't know, sort of the motivation to that. What I would suggest to you is it's a bad way of measuring. You're actually going to have a lot more measurement data if you take things and you loop them back to where the problem arose and measure the rework by the fact that it's gone back. That allows you to actually begin to measure the number of times things loop through your process, which is really, really interesting and important data. When you're doing this, again, as with the daily stand-up, setting a time limit, being very focused on data so that you're really analyzing important issues, not just whatever was top of mind, and setting a time limit. Because again, whatever comes out of this process improvement conversation, this retrospective, is work. You only have so much time to do process improvement work, and so you want to limit that, and you really want to prioritize that and only work on the most important stuff, work on the things that, that you can actually get done. There can be a temptation, actually I went the wrong way, to focus on things that feel very much under your control when you're identifying opportunities for improvement, sort of saying, well, we can't really do anything about that, so let's not even talk about it. Sometimes at first, when you're just getting going, that can be smart. Get sort of a cadence of delivery and improvement going in order to generate the credibility for outreach to people about asking them for help. But once you do have that, don't be self-limiting. Looking at this board again, if I've got, an average here in the 20s and 30s and so on, I've got outliers that are up into the, well above 100-day kind of a cycle time. If the work that's flowing through my system is of any value, of any reasonable value, there's very high financial leverage on making those improvements. So having the data and going out and saying, hey, we want to improve these things because we think that by fixing these things, we can take these things that are currently taking multiple hundreds of days and take them down into the 20s, that should be worth a lot of money. So I was working, I've done a fair bit of work with a very large aircraft engine manufacturer based here in the United Kingdom. I won't tell you the name, but you can guess. And they had processes that things took multiple years to get done. We were able to work with them. Actually, they did most of the work. We were just involved. But they took some of those things that took multiple years and turned them into things that took multiple months. Now, how much money do you think that's worth for a company that's making aircraft engines that are worth millions and millions and millions of dollars a day in operation? That's a lot of money. And so if you can generate the data to show the leverage points, serious managers who are worth their salt are going to want to get involved to improve those things. But if, on the other hand, you just say, we think there's an opportunity for improvement, our hunch is there's an opportunity for improvement, well, the highest paid person's opinion will usually win in that case. But if you've got data, That's powerful stuff. What you're aiming for in doing this is you're aiming for better decomposition and smoother flow, which allows you to establish delivery speed trends, in essence, service level agreements, SLAs. And by doing that, what you should be able to do is A, gain confidence, and B, be able to move away from detailed estimates. So I won't tell you to stop doing story point estimating to start with, but I will tell you that there's a fair amount of data out in the world that would suggest that most teams' ability to story point estimate, outside of the ability to say this is a story and this is a feature and this is an epic, people can kind of do that. But the difference between a 1 and a 2 and a 2 and a 3 and a 3 and a 5 usually comes, it's noise in the data. If you actually compare pre-execution estimates and post-execution cycle times, we're just not that good at it. So what you want to do is instead establish trends of data, and once you do that, you can use those, and your estimating, which is fundamentally a wasteful exercise, instead can shift to fundamentally being a decomposition exercise. And so rather than trying to guess how big something is, what you want to do is get into a mode where you're just saying, is this small enough to be counted as a card on our board? Because we think it's roughly in the average range of what a card on our board means. If it is, good. If it's TFB, too big, we need to break it down smaller. And if we have no clue, then we really need to have a lot of conversation. So we want to move away from a lot of time spent estimating to focusing most of our effort on decomposition, and especially some of our effort on better understanding those NFCs, because the NFCs, those are going to be the giant outliers. That's usually what you find when you go back and look at those, is there was just a lack of understanding of what was going on with them. So we want to move away from estimating and instead move to decomposition. So I've talked about so that this retrospective process, these feedback loops, these are going to allow us to start evolving our board. That's really what we want to do. We want to start with the process we have. We want to flow work through it. And as we do that, we use our retrospective, our feedback loop tools in order to more and more explicitly document our process, explicit policies in our process. So instead of having just a single lane for develop, I'm breaking things out into an in process and done, because by doing that I can better understand what portion of the work really is already done versus what portion we're really working on, better set WIP limits, better understand where the bottlenecks in my process are, as an example. I talked about that often you're going to discover that you have different workflows in your process. And so that's the idea of swim lanes on Kanban boards. That's very often what those are representing, is different process flows for different work item types or different levels of priority with the work that's flowing across your board. WIP limits. Again, we find that, I guess it depends on how much political capital you have to start with. It can be difficult for some teams to, at the beginning of the process, say, hey boss, you can't put work on my board. Stop. You may not have that power. So at first, there may just be, again, if you have too many cards for a column on the board, usually people are semi-reasonable. But over time, you do want to start actually putting in place specific WIP limits. Because if this is really happening on a board where things are bottling up in develop, it doesn't matter how fast I am in plan or how fast I am in test or deploy. Work is not going through this board. Work is not getting to done any faster than it can go through develop. And all the extra work that people upstream in plan are doing to put things in the waiting lane for the develop folks, it's just wasted effort. You're causing a problem. You're not actually adding value. So what we want to do is, in theory of constraint terms and lean terms, what we want to do is we want to elevate the bottleneck to start with. We want to identify where work bottles up in our process. And at first, just accept that that part of our process has a natural rate limit, a natural flow that work can go through it. And what we want to do is we want to set WIP limits in place that are roughly at sort of the natural flow of work flowing through that step in our process, and then set WIP limits for the other lanes on the board so that they are only putting work into that bottleneck at the pace that the bottleneck can deal with it. We're trying to set rate limiting steps upstream in order to manage flow at the bottleneck downstream. We're trying to balance the capacity there. So, sort of coming back to the Kanban method, I talked about steps of getting going in some examples. Just to remind you, what we're trying to do is we're visualizing current process flow. We're limiting work in progress, managing smooth flow. Those two levers of limiting work in progress and managing smooth flow are some of the biggest levers you have for improvement in speed within your organization. Doing less and doing it smoothly are the biggest tools you have for going fast. Making the process policies explicit, using the feedback loops to improve the process policies, and doing that collaboratively, working together collaboratively, that's what we're trying to do with Kanban. Starting from where we are. Especially if you are a Scrum team, where you should start from. Anybody who says we're going to stop doing Scrum to do Kanban doesn't understand Kanban. If you want to apply Kanban to improve your Scrum, that's fantastic. It's a great tool. But you should not throw out your Scrum to do that. Who's doing Scrum here with it?
Who feels like they're doing it pretty well? Are any complete newbies who would appreciate a little bit of what is Scrum? No, nobody's brave enough to admit? Probably somebody.
All right, so I won't explain Scrum. There's the Scrum Model, one of the various flavors of pictures that's used to describe Scrum. So rather than going through that, what I'll just do is compare and contrast here. So what fundamentally is Scrum? Scrum is a structure of roles, and rituals, and cadence. It says really nothing about visualization. It certainly doesn't say you can't visualize. Certainly doesn't say you can't WIP limit. Matter of fact, the cadence of sprints is fundamentally a batch size reduction exercise. It's just not a lane level batch reduction. It's a sort of the duration of the sprint batch reduction. Certainly doesn't say you can't measure flow. It just tends to focus on a single flow measurement of velocity versus throughput and cycle time and cumulative flow and the other things that we'll do within Kanban. And my experience is that really good Scrum teams, the best Scrum teams that I've ever seen, which are often in online game development companies, that's usually a really fast cadence that forces you to sort of get good or die. Those teams will, even though they will describe what they're doing as Scrum, it will end up looking very, very Kanban-ish. It's sort of, you say tomato, I say tomato kind of a thing. If they want to call it Scrum, cool, but it looks awfully Kanban-ish. So Scrum, I hope what you saw was nothing about Scrum was really not, contra to Kanban. Same thing, Kanban. What is Kanban? Well, it's evolution through measurement. That's fundamentally what it is. It's evolution through measurement. It has no opinion whatsoever on roles or meetings or iterations or any of those things. Kanban, the 6 things I listed in terms of principles of Kanban are things to do to measure. They say nothing about any of these other things. And if you were in the software dev space especially, now this isn't necessarily going to be true in the IT operations space or engineering or other places where you might apply Kanban, but in the software development space, most teams that I see do Kanban end up having a lot of the Scrum rituals anyway. They're useful rituals for software development teams. Now again, I wouldn't say that that's necessarily true if you're doing IT operations, if you're doing construction, if you're doing some of these other things. But in the software development space especially, there's certainly no, this talk of sort of Scrum versus Kanban as if they are competing methodologies is silly, because that's not what they are. They're two different things, both of which are useful. And to do these things well, it's so important that what we're doing is, yeah, there's the tactical practices, all of the things that I just talked about, the steps you take to implement this. But the real power in this is beyond the tactical practices, and it's the principles. It's the lean principles, the agile values, all those things, those kinds of things. That's really what we're trying to do, and you can use both of these tools in order to do that. I mentioned earlier, a lot of what I've been talking about today is sort of a summation and pulled out of something that we produced called the Kanban Roadmap. This is available for free online, leankit.com/learn. There's also lots of articles, ebooks, webinars, templates, case studies, et cetera, et cetera. Really great stuff, all of it free. In some cases, you might need to give us an email address, but I promise we don't spam. If anybody spams you, let me know, and I am the boss, I'll stop them. So some key reading for getting going with Kanban. David Anderson's blue book on Kanban is kind of the seminal work for a lot of folks in this. Jim Benson and Tony Ann De Maria Berry's personal Kanban is a lot of the psychology of it, why this works, not just that it does work. Matthias Skarn and Heinrich Nyberg, both with CRISP in Scandinavia, have written some really good books in the space. And if you really, the top 4 books are all pretty sort of case study focused, pretty simple, easy reads. If you truly want to get good at this and smart at this and understand why it works, not just that it does work, Don Reinertsen's The Principles of Product Development Flow is the best book in existence for helping you understand the mechanics of this stuff and why it's not just rules of thumb and belief systems and religions. This is all underpinned by math, and that's why it works. And so with that, I will wrap things up and would be very happy to take questions. Yes?
Hi. How do you see the role of customer support and that being managed with Kanban boards? And how do you see that affecting work in progress limits?
It depends on work item type. So what I've seen customer support teams use Kanban, it's usually not for their very high volume, short touch time kinds of tickets. The things that take a few minutes to deal with, those they usually just deal with them in Zendesk or Remedy or whatever their current system is. Customer support teams will usually use Kanban to visualize their longer duration, sort of fixed project, large customer project kinds of things. And so what they're in essence going to do is they're going to set WIP limits for that sort of stuff, that understands that that sort of stuff is only a relatively small part of their workload, and sort of we're throttling down to say, you know, I understand that I get 50 tickets a day. Those 50 tickets a day on average take this amount of time, which means I'm going to leave this amount of time free. And so if that's true, I probably have 2 hours a day for these bigger things. And so I'm going to set my WIP limits accordingly. But they don't. Sometimes I have seen teams who are using electronic tools that will visualize all of their tickets just so they have a sense of the flow of them. But in terms of manual movement of cards, they usually only do it for the big, slower, longer running stuff.
You said that Kanban and Scrum exist side by side. How does that work when you look at something like decomposition and estimation?
That's why I said that you know, if I'm talking to a Scrum team who wants to start using Kanban, I don't start off the game by saying stop doing story point estimating. Keep doing it for a while. What I'm usually going to do, though, is go back after the fact and say, let's take a look at your process control diagrams, and let's do that comparison of what you estimated for your story points and how long things actually took. And then, like I said, there's reams and reams of data out there. I'd be willing to make a 5-pound bet with most any team that if we run a board for about 3 months that they can stop doing story point estimating, that they're just sort of wasting their time with actually applying the numbers. Now again, that doesn't mean you don't have sort of a queue replenishment exercise when you talk about the work items, but it becomes a much shorter thing where you're just saying, here's an item, I'm describing it to the team, is this small enough as it is to be a card? And by now you know that cards on our board range from 3 days to 8 days. That's kind of the typical range. Is this somewhere between 3 and 8 days in everybody's sense? Yeah, good, it's a card. If somebody says, no, that's way too big, okay, how do we break it in pieces? Or, again, I just don't understand it, we need to talk about it more. So it's not that you stop doing right away, it's just that usually the data will tell you your time is better spent elsewhere. So it's not a religious thing, it's data-driven. The reasonable?
Yeah. I mean,
I like to be data-driven. It's not opinion-based.
You talk about walking around and seeing Kanban boards in an office.
Mm-hmm.
So are you all about the physical board or electronic boards? There's always a tough choice between having something, especially if you've got distributed teams across different time zones.
So that's certainly, when you're getting started, physical boards are awfully cheap. So when you're trying to get things going and establish the habits of visualization, physical boards can be great. On the other hand, like you say, distributed teams, there is a place for electronic tools. I have a favorite one, you might guess. What I would say, though, is that if you're going to do that, you would be wise to take advantage of the fact that big screens are really cheap these days. So if you look at the cost of labor in a typical software development team, a large screen TV, a 70-inch TV, is like a day's worth of labor for one software developer, right? So if you believe the sort of the hype that agile methods, here's what I'll tell you is it's almost like a joke how predictable it is that within a few months Kanban teams will improve their cycle time by 30-ish%. And if you're doing valuable work, that 30% should be quite a bit of money. That should pay for some TVs. So that's my suggestion, is usually start physical, but I don't think it's wise to try to continue to maintain sort of mirrored physical and electronic. It's just a lot of work. I would suggest the better thing to do is to take advantage of large screen TVs, get those, put them up around. I wouldn't tend to tell people to do touch screens. They're neat. There's a temptation to geek out on the technology of those, but A, they're quite a bit more expensive per size, and B, what that's doing is that's limiting you to the screen being logged into a particular user, so all the actions in the system are taken by whoever it's logged in as, rather than the real person. If you're going to do the large screens, it's usually better to do like stand-ups, to just have it attached as a dumb monitor and use iPads, iPhones, laptops brought up during the stand-up to move cards.
How do you recommend breaking up the work of the business? For example, I can see how this works easily when you've got maybe a large business with 1 or 2 major products. You've got a smaller team working on maybe 50, 60 different products or projects, or if they're smaller. How do you tend to break it up?
Well, I mean, you're certainly going to have different work item types for the different, or some sort of a visual indicator, a data aggregator for the work on different systems. What I've sometimes seen people do is have multiple boards, and those multiple boards, you'll have a sort of a top level board that will represent the larger things, and then the lower level board or boards that represent the lower level items, the smaller level of detail. And then you sort of associate the items on one to items on the other, and that's letting you know via the top level board which systems are more important right now, and therefore which associated small work items are going to be the most important things that you're going to work on. And a key thing in doing that, in managing that kind of stuff, is really focusing the team on flow of value rather than particular things that they own. That's how you survive in that kind of a work environment. I've definitely worked with teams who are in that kind of a situation. And actually what I would suggest is Kanban visualization, well, especially large batch Scrum without visualization is very hard for those types of teams to do. That's if they're not in the greenfield world. Kanban, while it can scare the crap out of them because it's like, oh my God, I have that much work. You did actually already have that work before. You now have a better handle on it. And when you have conversations with stakeholders about those systems, one of the things I've seen people be able to do is the manager, whoever is in charge of the team who's doing the work, sort of pulls themselves out of the conversation and puts together the stakeholders for the competing things and kind of says, there's the board, you guys tell me which of those things we need to work on. It's your decision, it's not mine. And there's a power in sort of making it a third party rather than a person-to-person argument. Yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering what you think about switching from Scrum to Kanban or Kanban to Scrum occasionally.
Well, like I said, I think I don't view it as a switch. I really don't. You should not wholesale switch. You know, I think you are foolish not to visualize. I mean, I do believe you should do the Kanban things. I think you are foolish not to visualize. I think you are missing out on process improvement opportunity by not having a more granular picture of your process flow than just sort of backlog in progress done. I think you having a more granular work item type breakdown using the measurement, I think all of these things are tools that it's sort of the, if all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail kind of a thing. Well, you do actually have more tools in the Kanban toolbox. And so if you're a Scrum team, again, I wouldn't say stop doing Scrum. I would just say, why would you not visualize your work at a higher level of granularity? Why would you not try to implement WIP limits? Why would you not work towards smooth process flow? Why would you, it's sort of the, take the name Kanban off of them. Just say, are these bad things to do? Why would we not do them? That would be my take. And then if you're sort of, on the Kanban side, if you're saying, look, we should do Scrum, if somebody within a Kanban team is saying we should do Scrum, that could be perfectly true. And it would, what I would say is take the labels off again, and I would say, what is it about Scrum that you're aiming for? Is it, do you want a cadence? Okay, good. What are we going to use that cadence for? Are we trying to align the work of multiple teams? And so we want to put them on a cadence that's synchronized, that kind of a thing? Are we finding that we're having a hard time just saying the team is going to measure, and instead we want to establish sort of a Scrum Master, somebody whose job it is to help the team, coach the team a bit? That can be a good and powerful thing. But I would not take it from a, this is wrong, switch to the right thing. I would say, let's break out the specific things we think we're going to get from it and do those things and keep doing the other things that are working.
So I run Agile or Kanban, whatever it's called, for several years. I realized very difficult is that how to make sure the team update story or task accurately daily.
Yeah.
I mean, usually what I did and I got my team to do is remind again and again. I met a team from China, now in UK.
Yeah.
What I realized that for engineers, especially young engineers, they don't enjoy to update their task or story stays on Kanban, whatever is lectured or on board.
Yeah.
So how to encourage people to do this consistently?
It's only going to work if the team is bought into the collective process improvement. If it's not, I'm updating tickets because somebody says you should update tickets. If that's the game, then it's going to fail. Stop, don't even do it. And Kanban works if the team believes that this is a tool that they're going to use to improve how their work happens, right? If they believe that it's a way of gathering data in order to understand where to improve their process. If they understand it's a lever that's going to get them improvement. If they don't believe that, then it will not work. You can't impose this. You can't, again, if it's like, if it's I'm the boss, do this because I want you to, Just give up. That's why I started this with, the people need to be focused on, the point here is lean. The point here is agile. The point is the broader tool set and the way that those things empower. So I don't have this particular slide in this slide deck, but there's, I think that if you look at lean, agile, DevOps, Kanban, Scrum, all of sort of modern management methods, and you compare them to the traditional way of managing organizations, they boil down to two fundamental differences. One is one is a belief in how people are motivated, and the other is a belief in what's valuable in terms of the flow of things and measuring work. So the motivation part, traditional management believes that people are inherently lazy. They inherently don't want to do work, and that a manager's job is to use carrots and sticks in order to force people to do what they would otherwise not do, right? Modern management methods believe that that's not true, that people are inherently motivated by a belief in the value of what they're trying to achieve, and that if you can help them understand the value of it, and if you can give them some control and power over their environment, that they want to do a good job. Now, is that true of everybody? No, there are lazy people, there are bad people, but not most people. And then in terms of the measurement of things, traditional management believes that what we want to do is we want to measure utilization of resources and keep resources busy, and that that's where we get value. Modern management methods believe that what we're doing is we're measuring the flow of value through a system, and what's inherently valuable is value coming out the other side, and that's what we're going to optimize for. The organization has to believe in those things, from the top to the bottom, whatever the top is. I mean, probably if you're a giant megacorp, the top is so far away, it might as well be God, but the top in a reasonable sense. You got to have a buy-in to those general ideas at all levels. Otherwise, it's going to fail because it's just a ticketing system, and people, they can smell it when it's cheating.
So I've heard rumours that Anderson's thinking about adding roles to Kanban. From your experience, are there any patterns of what kind of roles tend to start to emerge?
Well, I don't necessarily agree with some of that stuff. So my take is that I'm very much of a lean guy. And so I'm a pretty big believer that this stuff only works at scale if management becomes part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And so I'm not a believer in creating new extra roles to try to work around problems in the old roles. I think you really have to, you have to change the way of thinking of the people who are in charge, or it's really never going to thrive. You have to have, I think you've got to have, for technology organizations, it's going to be different organizations, you've got to have really strong empowered technical leadership paired up with really strong empowered product leadership. In essence, sort of, you got to do the cart has to be pulled by two horses, one of which is, here's what we're doing and why, and here's how we're doing it and who's doing it. You got to have, in essence, you have to create a balance between those things so that they're pulling in tandem, but they're both crucially important. I don't think, if it's there, great, but I'm not a particular believer in sort of Scrum mastery roles, because I do think that that should just be part of the job of managers and the team. And you don't need it if you're doing a good job. So, I don't know. Your results may vary, and if it's useful for your organization, do it. But I wouldn't do it because I think, again, if you create new roles to work around problems in the old roles, it's going to fall apart eventually. You got to fix the problem. And the problems that you need to fix are going to be shown to you by the board and the data and that kind of thing. And you should focus on that, not just, we got to put roles in because the book says put roles in. My 2 cents.
How would you do the visualization of workflow where you have things that come into
your ecosystem, the bits you have control over, and then leave and then come back. For example, third line, they provide a workaround to customer services, and then it's stuck there for 3 months waiting for the customer to come back and tell you that actually, yes, that workaround worked.
Different ways. If the other team is actually doing Kanban is in essence part of the system, then moving cards between boards is a good thing. So if the work has left my power and it's now in somebody else's power, it's in their power, and it should be, in essence, hurting their cycle time, not mine, if they're part of the same system. If they're not, then it's still, I've seen teams gain a tremendous amount of power by having a column on their board that represents the handoff, so that things can sit in there, so that they can then generate that data, and that it moves it from a world of, I think you guys are the problem and you're slowing me down, to here's my cycle time without those things, and here's my cycle time with those things. Okay, now let's have a reasonable conversation about what we can do to speed the handoffs between those things and shorten the feedback loops and those kinds of things. So if you can make them part of the system, so you're having smooth flow of cards back and forth, if you can't, still visualizing them can give you a lot of power to have it not be opinion-based conversation.
Thank you.
This all sounds like an excellent way for improving operational predictability. Is there any danger to this effect, or is there still room for creativity and innovation within this?
Sure. If your board represents the operational stages of a process for types of work that are relatively predictable, then you're going to have relatively little variability and you manage accordingly. On the other hand, if your board, or a section of the board, because it may be different lanes that represent a long process flow, the lanes that are further upstream, the fuzzy front end, you're going to expect a lot more variability in that part of the process, and that's okay. And so I showed you that picture of the process cycle, showing the variability of the data points. If you're talking about the upstream lanes, you're going to see a much broader spread, and that's okay, versus the closer you get to downstream, the less variability you should see, and you should manage accordingly. As a matter of fact, what I would say is if you're doing R&D work, true R&D work, and there's a temptation in the software development world to say we're doing R&D work. Nah, if we're doing web development on pages that's pretty consistent stuff, you're a lot more towards the D end and not the R end. Don't kid yourself. But if you're truly doing innovative stuff with new technologies and you're trying to innovate, you should expect, and as a matter of fact, you should manage for a fair amount of variability. And if you don't get it, what that tells you is you have a bad selection process that's not getting enough tough things into your process. So what you should be doing is you should be looking and saying, like, if I'm really truly managing a research process, I might say I'm aiming for a 50% dropout rate, where of all the things that start my process, 50% of them we stop before they get to the right side of my board. And that's not failure, that's expected. Now, if it's a failure in sort of execution, that might be different. We want to improve it. And that's what, that's what we would have to look for. I talked about that, looking sort of like common cause and special cause variation. If I go and look at those outliers, some of them I would say like, wow, yeah, this took forever because it was a completely new, brand new technology. We've never done it before. We're really trying this. We need to try 50 times before we're going to get it right, versus these ones all go wrong because we're just not testing properly. Those are different things. All righty. Well, thank you very much, folks. Really appreciate your time.